As players of this great game, Dungeons and Dragons, and everything that has stemmed from it, we have the fortune to be close enough to its origins to have access to the primary source material that hasn't yet been thrown away, as well as the knowledge that these documents are worth preserving and studying. We also have the final piece to make meaning of these documents and history, which is a brilliant and passionate historian. Like many of us, perhaps, I first became aware of Jon Peterson when I bought his book, Playing at the World. That massive volume, which, as you can see, I have read and studied, provided me with a much-needed context for not only the RPG work I was doing, but also for the wargames that I covered early in this channel's history. But what I'm going to be talking about here is Peterson's latest work, The Elusive Shift, How Role-Playing Games Have Forged Their Identity. This book covers in a great deal of detail, as we look at part of the table of contents here, the early years of D&D and how the playing community, the designing community, talked about and thought about the ways in which these games were played. As we know, there was a total change in game playing culture after D&D was invented versus before. But as Peterson points out, this shift was not something like from A to B. It was much more elusive, and it was not necessarily by design. And we'll talk about that a little bit in this video in terms of what he presents as an argument as we look here at a partial listing of some of his primary source material. There was an incredibly rich critical and design and player-oriented history and writing about D&D and other role-playing games contemporaneous to the time that they were being developed. And Peterson mines this trove of original material very effectively in this book. And I would say it's almost a hallmark of his work in this field as a historian to go directly to the sources, to probably own and have many of the sources himself. And that's what's so special about the relationship of game historians to RPGs, that the distance from them is not so far that these original source materials can't be consulted and unearthed. And this book is rife with quotations of this original source material. As he writes, that the crucial period from 1975 to 1980 is not studied very much now, and it will offer insights into how and why the term role-playing stuck around. He says, though, that the attachment of role-playing to D&D was largely a historical accident, and makes the point that if there was some other term, like adventure gaming, used instead, that might have been the one to stick. But the bulk of the community settled on role-playing, and it became then a prophecy that the theory and practice had to fulfill. Late in the book, there is a graph presented that talks about an outline that was proposed early on for different types of players in the game. Stated, of course, that there isn't necessarily just one type of player in any one game, and that these oppositions are somewhat schematic just for the purposes of discussion. But it's interesting to look at this and understand an overview of what's discussed in the book. That on the one hand, we have the role players, the pure fantasy role players, where there is cooperation between PCs and the GM, and that the characters are seen to influence events in the game, and that's sort of in opposition to those that are coming more out of a wargaming background or approaching it more like wargaming, where the rules and mechanics are more important, and the players are really there to execute a system that is more of a mental contest between the GM and the players. And one other way of thinking about this is an opposition between whether the characters are essential in a game or the characters are disposable in a game. There's also an opposition between what is referred to elsewhere in the book as ego tripping or power gaming, which is basically the PCs make themselves into exaggerated versions of themselves, and the goal is to just kind of get stuff and level up and obtain things in the game, where the goals are become personal, as opposed to a game where the goals are more campaign oriented, and this is identified more with a storytelling on the part of the GM, that there's world building and NPCs and a kind of more three-dimensional view of what's going on. And again, another way of contrasting these two things is that on the one hand, with the power gaming, it's what the players want that's most important, and the player's will becomes most important. And with the storytelling aspect, it's what the referee wants, and the GM's goals are more important, and the players are there to live in that world. This is kind of an overview of a model that took hold, that embraced the tension and contradiction that became at the heart of discussing the games and whether the story is pre-written by a game master or whether it is kind of co-created between players and the GM. Teasing apart how this was written about and understood is really at the heart of this book. A question is posed early on about asking how you're supposed to play the original D&D. What form of participation did the players have? And to think about a game, even a pen and paper game, as having the question of what to do when it arrives to the table in whatever form that might be is pretty astounding. And it does sort of sum up the degree to which the arrival of D&D and all that it spawned changed gaming so significantly. Because imagine a board game showing up and not knowing what the players are supposed to do. I venture to guess that you could sit down with a board game in a totally other language that you did not speak and look through the components and have some very, very vague sense of what to do. Yet the amount of discussion in D&D early on and even now about the role of the player versus the role of GM is dynamic and continuing and at the heart, in a sense, of understanding why we care about the origins of D&D and why the origins of D&D matter even today for our play styles, and maybe even especially matter today with so many types of role-playing games being produced. It is in the discussion of role-playing games outside of heroic fantasy that we can more easily see how these games begin to simulate a story rather than just simulate a world for characters to wander around in. There's a discussion of Top Secret from 1977 and a reproduction of a diagram, a schematic diagram of the game plan, wherein we see how each node in this flowchart is a stage of a narrative, and that the outline of the game plan is really the outline of a story with aspects of scenes and relationships between events. Of particular interest to viewers of this channel, perhaps, is Peterson's discussion of the very early acknowledgement and indeed incorporation of rules for solo play into this new form of gaming. He talks about On Guard, which in 1975 offered an entire system that didn't specifically mention a referee, and which also divided play into strict turns, much like a board game. And of course, Gary Gygax's solo dungeon adventure rules from the Strategic Review, also from 1975. And if you're interested in my further thoughts on that, you can check out the video I did on that. The extensive series of Tunnels and Trolls, beginning with Buffalo Castle in 1978, took soloing to a different place and further extended the role-playing experience out from its origins. All of these discussions in the book expand what the scope of this term could mean and further develop a discussion of the diversity of practices that were grouped under the phrase role-playing. One of my most prized possessions in the D&D world is this copy of Outdoor Survival, and in particular the map here, as you can see it, because I purchased this used. I was not old enough to be playing D&D at the time this came out. Some player, you can see here if you know the map, has drawn in some materials, a river, I guess, or a road here, and there's numbers here up and down the side, and it's a piece of gaming history because, as we know, this game, this Avalon Hill game, Outdoor Survival, was one of the officially sanctioned ways to play D&D in an overland kind of way. One of the reasons why this book is so vital to those of us who play RPGs now, particularly if you are watching this video because you know my channel from the solo RPG work that I present, but even if you were a regular tabletop RPG player, the idea that role-playing and role-playing games are a platform for people's creativity, and that the game itself can be interpretive, and that role-playing was an aspect of this, and a way that was a shift and a change to a new type of game, these are explored in the book. This is key to what this book considers. And it's through a look at the relationship between player agency and the established rules of the game, between something like a printed map and a DM changing the landscape of both the campaign as well as the game itself, that this book elaborates in detail by going right to the primary sources. For those of us who play RPGs, especially those of us who are GMs or those of us who do solo work with RPGs, as I most often do these days, this book, well, before I talk about this book, I'll say thinking about the process of the structure of what role-playing games offer, whatever the rule set, whatever the genre, whether you're working with old school material or new material, especially the movement now with independent game designs, all of this calls out for an interrogation of exactly what it is that we're working with. What is this entity that is so malleable, that is allowing us to create these variety of stories in such a wide range of ways with mechanics as well as theme? For those of us that engage with this, as on the GM side of things in particular, understanding where the pieces have come from is very illuminating and will enrich our current play. And I think that's one of the strongest recommendations for this book, is that if you are a GM wanting to improve your engagement with the game, have an understanding of where these various pieces came from and how they can inform your current gaming, this book has a lot to offer. The other thing is, for just players of the game, has an almost obsessive attention to detail, as is the hallmark of this writer, unearthing the words, the language, the thought process, sometimes contradictory, of course, because it's not as if the players were setting out to make a revolution in gaming, but that is what happened. And the contours of the way in which thought evolved around the game, and the role of players and the role of referees in it, and the relationship between what was a pre-existing structure and what was going to be formed on the fly and taken in different direction. All of these things are discussed in detail here, and it's a really compelling read for that reason. It is, again, as I said at the beginning of the video, we're fortunate as lovers of role-playing games to have somebody who is such a steward of their history and is preserving so much of what could be lost to future generations and also current players. So this has just been a gloss on the richness of this book and the great contribution it is making to not only the history of role-playing games, but understanding the current variety of practices of GMs and players around the table. It often feels special to be a part of the Dungeons and Dragons and RPG world, especially as the hobby extends itself to more casual players and becomes popularized with certain TV shows and whatever. It feels nice to have been there all along. And one of the reasons I think for me that it feels so special is the history of care that has been put into the hobby, written care, thinking about the reasons for doing things, thinking about the importance of various design aspects of what role-playing games are. And in this book, Jon Peterson is getting to the core of how the creators of D&D and the original early players actually talked about and thought about something so central to role-playing games that it's in the very name that we call it, the role-playing aspect of it. The book makes it clear that there's no simple answers. If you're looking for a quick read with a simple conclusion, this is not the book for you. But if you're looking for a well thought out, extensively researched, and impeccably presented discussion of some of the debates, the design debates, the mechanic debates, the thinking about what it means to create a fantasy world and how this new form of gaming could be understood and described and articulated and enacted. This is a book to seriously consider. I would say no serious player of any RPG who is a GM at the least should be without Jon Peterson's work, because understanding the development of the field is very informative in the practice of the game right now. Whether you are a GM sitting around a table as the game was designed to be, or a GM and a player sitting with yourself trying to play something solo and create a narrative experience using RPG mechanics in a solo manner, this book has something to offer you. The hobby is better for having a historian like Jon Peterson in it, and for that matter, MIT Press as a whole has an excellent library of game studies books. I'm showing you some of the ones that I personally own here. I recommend also checking out their game studies list if you're interested in game design and game history. All of this background can inform and enhance your day-to-day playing.